All right, hi everyone. My name is Heva, and I'm a Spring member based in so-called Hamilton, Ontario, as Bonnie so kindly introduced us. I became a Spring member a little over 4 years ago in July of 2020, when everything was over Zoom. And one of my professors around that time, Dr. James Carnes, had acknowledged I had a lot of complex feelings about the state of our world, and felt as though Spring could be a place I could utilize those thoughts and feelings and put them into action. I'll be honest, when first introduced to Spring, I had a very little understanding of what socialism truly was. I remember being 16 and trying to read a book on Marx, which led me to reread the opening chapter over and over again, as my brain couldn't seem to comprehend the words, which is still kind of relatable to this day. But Spring was an incredible starting point as my comrades valued my lived experience and didn't use inaccessible jargon while organizing. This is not to say that Spring's politics are not firmly shaped by theories, but it is exactly this theory that strategically meets people where they're at, focusing on ways to ground their everyday struggles to our larger structures and to find tangible tasks people can engage in for larger movement building. While I place no value in liberal identity politics, my life has been shaped by my experience as a queer Iranian person. And I've had the privilege of organizing among comrades that have dedicated their organization to being structurally built on equity. And for those of you who are longtime socialists, as I've heard from many, that's not a very common experience to have. So equity and it being one of the pillars of Spring is what I'll be speaking to you about today. As a revolutionary socialist organization, Spring members place emphasis on solidarity across struggles and the ways capitalism requires the ongoing domination and exploitation of all working class peoples. However, we also recognize particular communities that have a distinct relationship to capitalism. And at Spring, we aim to center these struggles and not fall into the class reductionist category that we know will not liberate us. In their article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, often referencing Frantz Fanon, outline various power relations that have developed following colonization, and specifically referencing colonization on Turtle Island. So external colonialism is identified as the expropriation of indigenous worlds, animals, plants, and human beings for wealth. And internal colonialism is noted as the management of people and land within the borders of a nation. So this is done through modes of control, such as prisons, schooling, and policing. And through this distinction, we're able to see how external colonialism requires the violent displacement of indigenous land and peoples, and devastated indigenous language, cultural practices, communities, legal systems, and ways of life. And through the frame of internal colonialism, we're able to see how state control is all-encompassing to ensure indigenous subjugation, which now also disproportionately impacts other marginalized groups. My educational background in social work has given me the privilege of learning various Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee teachings, which often emphasize respect for all of our relations, including the land, the animals, people, organisms, and spirit. And through this, it's clear how many traditional indigenous worldviews on the land and our responsibility to one another are in direct contradiction with capitalist notions of the land as a commodity to be owned and extracted for wealth. And it is distinctly for this reason that Canada as a nation state is built on genocidal policies on the basis of race to further their capitalist and colonial aims. Canada's history of slavery and subsequent anti-Black racism, as well as other racist policies based on labor exploitation, such as exploitative migrant worker policies, help us understand how capitalism does not exist without racism, and racism does not exist without capitalism. Our working class is racialized, disabled, Indigenous, queer, and trans, and non-status. And in order to build the people's power, we need to push against what Marx called the muck of ages, where oppressive ideas are pushed down to divide workers. And this need for solidarity is especially important in our current political climate, where the right wing is mobilized to strategically target the trans community, migrant workers, and international students, among other groups, which has not only led to increased violence and safety concerns for these communities, but shifting away from class consciousness and solidarity across struggles. So I'm really wanting to emphasize how recognizing our differences is not a dividing force, but an integral part of building a meaningful, multiracial, diverse working class that is representative of the people. As someone from Iran, there are often really important times of mass struggle and uprising that are inevitably violent, And that comes with a lot of grief, which can be debilitating at times. And I know a lot of us can feel this way with what some call political depression. But being in Spring has not only shown me what global solidarity looks like, as my comrades have a vested interest in liberation of all oppressed peoples, but being organized is so much different than what you can do as an individual. If I wasn't able to show up in a certain way due to whatever reason, that was okay, because I had comrades in the streets denouncing any war with Iran and writing articles. And it is through organizing that we're able to have revolutionary optimism and not feel so isolated, and we do this by using various strategies and tactics. From the early days of Spring in 2019 to 2020, the organization was involved with struggles for the revolution in Sudan, the COVID-19 pandemic and its disproportionate impact on Black workers, and migrant justice, to name a few struggles. And this is to say that we are explicitly internationalist, meaning that we are anti-imperialist and support workers and oppressed peoples around the world in their struggle for liberation, as we know a socialist revolution is not possible within the confines of a border. And so centering equity in Spring has meant making systemic efforts to make sure we're not reproducing racist and white supremacist dynamics within the organization. And one way that has taken place is through the BIPOC Leadership Development Program, which began in 2020 to 2021. And this program has provided 10 Spring comrades with financial support to learn about various topics, to organize and lead educational meetings, such as teaching about Canada's violent history of genocide and oppression. And so we hope to expand this program in the near future to focus on interlocking oppressions. And another more inconspicuous example that has always stood out to me in Spring's centering of equity is how we use an equity speakers list, as Bonnie had mentioned, to make sure that we prioritize the voices that have been historically marginalized, especially in leftist spaces. So I just want to wrap up by taking a moment to honor our late Spring comrade, Sarah Higazi, who was a queer Egyptian socialist that was imprisoned in 2017 after raising a rainbow flag at a Mashru Leila concert in Cairo. Sarah sought asylum and came to Canada in 2018 and became involved in Spring in 2019. Sarah died by suicide in June of 2020 after being deeply traumatized by her incarceration as well as other life struggles. And Sarah was a deeply cared for comrade and friend to many in our organization. And I bring her up today as I feel her story is particularly important with respect to equity. Imperial, colonial, capitalist, and state violence has taken so many lives, and I think it's important to honor the comrades we have lost and remind ourselves why we continue together and struggle. Thank you.
Thank you, Heva. That was amazing. We've been through this a couple of times as a dress rehearsal, but each time I hear it, I'm blown away by everyone's experience. So my name is Ayesha. I'm a proud member of Spring, the co-chair of Spring Labor Caucus. Our mission at Spring is to ignite the passion of the rank and file. So for the past 2 years, I've had the privilege of being part of Spring, and to all my comrades in the room and allies, thank you for welcoming me in. It's such a privilege to be amongst people who continue to fight. What led me to Spring and what drew me to Spring was my hope of finding people with similar shared values of building the rank and file. So here at Spring, we thrive. We learn from each other, from our organizing experience, and we put our skills into action, and I think that's what's really important. We take what we learn from one another and we put it into action, whether it be on the picket lines, whether it be at rallies, sorry about that, writing articles, producing podcasts, and organizing conferences to meet folks like you. We believe that we learn by doing and sharing experiences. We meet on a regular basis to discuss our successes and our challenges so we can refine our strategy. So when I first joined Spring, I worked for a union, and surprisingly, that union was not interested in engaging its members or mobilizing. And it was pretty shocking to me because I offered to do it at zero cost, no cost at all. I was gonna do it on my off time, and they were like, absolutely not. And so that was baffling because I'm like, oh, unions should be like social justice oriented. And so I came to Spring because I was super confused about what was happening in the labor movement. And so that's what led me here. So as I started to attend meetings, I started learning the language of the labor movement, and one of those was the rank and file. It's a term that's central to Spring's mission and the work that we believe in. So what is the rank and file? So these are the workers on the front line, directly doing the work on the shop floor. They're not part of the leadership, but they are the heart and soul of our movement. These everyday workers know their job better than anyone else, and they have these relationships, pre-existing relationships with their coworkers, and are able to build on that. It's the grassroots strength that drives the real change. As Spring members, we believe the power of organized workers is the catalyst for change. When workers unite, we can compel leadership to act and drive real change. Too often, we assume that leadership in unions or political parties will automatically organize and focus on social justice issues. And when this doesn't happen, it can leave us feeling pretty discouraged or questioning what our role is. The answer is simple: it's to organize. So I'm going to tell you a little story that actually Fred Hahn brought up yesterday, and it's probably brought up a lot because it's quite remarkable. And he spoke about the education workers who were locked in tough negotiations with the Ford government. And what the Ford government did was pass Bill 28, if you remember, to make it illegal for them to strike and was going to fine them. What a lot of folks don't realize is that the union leadership was actually very hesitant to go against the government. It was the education workers who really mobilized, united, and organized, and fought really hard and pulled their leadership into action. And that leadership, that union leadership, did follow and did, support its members. But stripping workers of their rights like that sounds like a very corrupt government, and it's not in the best interest of the workers. But that story that Fred Hahn spoke about was a great example about how the rank and file really take control, organize, and mobilize, and are victorious. So it shows us that this can happen, but it doesn't happen spontaneously. Right? We have to be organized. We have to know who our allies are in our movement, and we need to build on it. Revolutions, any of that, it doesn't come out of nowhere. It really takes a strategic plan and to execute it. So here at Spring, we understand the gaps between the rank and file members and their leadership, and our mission here is to empower rank and file workers to understand really how do you navigate that union. Because oftentimes unions may not actually tell you about that because they're trying to keep you out. They don't want you to feel empowered and perhaps take over the leadership. But that's our focus here, is we really want to try to build the rank and file. The workers are the forefront of that movement. The strength and awareness of the rank and file can only grow through direct action. And so at Spring, we share stories with one another, which truly empowers us, and we believe in the strength of the organized workers. These narratives inspire us by showcasing what is possible when we come together, and we learn from one another's experience, like I mentioned. Another thing that Spring did is we held a Spring Strike Solidarity School. So we realized when we were on the picket lines that, a lot of people were unclear of what to do on the picket line. And so we held this, and we talked about what to expect on picket lines. And of course, you all know that this is not something that we learn in school. They don't want us to be politically aware of the strength that ordinary folks like us have when we organize. Secondly, given that a lot of unions have turned away from being organizing unions, they have not actually prepared workers to be on strike. So often what I've seen is, it'll end up being on strike, but sometimes unions won't prepare you because that's not necessarily where they want to go. So they try to hold out of squashing, going on strike, but then when they go on strike, they're not fully prepared. So in the Spring Strike Solidarity School, we shared lots of experiences about, folks' experiences about what it meant to be on a picket line. We at Spring, when we do go together, actually, we go with a plan. And the plan is, we often talk to picket captains before we go, just so that they know we are coming. We try our best to take food, because food makes folks happy. It makes me happy. And we go with chants, because chants really uplift spirits. And believe me when I tell you that people are so happy when they see you coming, because it really shows camaraderie and support, and that the community is with folks that are on the picket line. And so in between our own strikes, we really encourage our members to get on those picket lines to show that we are together and we are fighting together. So yeah, it can definitely be intimidating going on, but we do go with a thoughtful plan and encourage others to do so as well. Also, when we're on the picket line, it gives us this amazing opportunity to have one-on-one conversation with workers, and that's really the building blocks of having these relationships and bringing other people into the movement. We spot leaders that are there, we find people that want to be involved, and we talk to them about what it means to be in Spring. And that's where we find a lot of folks and bring them into the movement. We also engage people through our Spring Labor Caucus. It's a space for workers both inside and outside our union to connect and build meaningful allyship. We gather semi-regularly to discuss political issues that impact our work, creating opportunities for members from different provinces to connect and collaborate. In the past, we've hosted a reading series. The book that we read together was Secrets of a Successful Organizer, and we do have it over there as well at the back. It was the first time I read this book with my comrades, but it was great because we got to talk about powerful organizing stories that were strategic, that worked, and it gave us the theoretical framework for change and demonstrated how theories can come to life. And I think that's the big thing about Spring that differentiates us from a lot of folks, is that we take that theory, we don't just sit in a room and always just talk. We love talking, but then we also take that talk back on the ground where it really truly matters. So in fact, that book is where I actually first read it. Again, it's at the back. I highly recommend it. It talks about the importance of having those one-to-one conversations, mapping your workplace or your organization just to know where your allies are, because that's the most important thing. We're not going to win this on our own. We're truly not. The more people that we have, the more likely we're going to win. The power is in the people, and I think you heard that a lot yesterday throughout the talks that we had. We're not going to be doing this on our own, and that's also why we have these conferences, our meetings, to bring folks in to grow and grow. So our next Labor Caucus is on Sunday at 10 a.m. at the Imperial Pub. And so that's tomorrow, and we're looking forward to seeing you. It's going to be a great opportunity. Last year was fantastic. So as I mentioned, rank and file organizing is crucial to changing our social conditions. One person on their own, like I mentioned, is not going to be able to do this. It's collective action that needs to be strategic and well thought out. Finding allies and working together helps with the division of labor and helps with troubleshooting issues that are encountered. It is our hope to continue to build the movement and look forward to seeing all of you out at our meetings and our virtual meetings. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Ayesha and Heva, for your amazing thoughts so far. Hi, everyone. My name's Carlie. As Bonnie mentioned, I'm a Spring member based here in Toronto. I joined Spring in 2022, and over these past few years, I've been able to learn so much about organizing through the lens of revolutionary socialism. And one of the key ways I've had an opportunity to learn these skills is through Spring's publication, and more frequently through our podcast, Spring Radio, which I'm honored to be on the team for. One of the core pillars of Spring's organizing has been around the concept of revolutionary journalism through the publication of Spring Magazine. I followed Spring on social media and read their articles well before I knew that we were an organized socialist group. Through Spring Mag's Instagram, I came across a post asking people to get involved, and that's when I finally took the chance to come to a meeting and see exactly what it was all about. And this seems to be a common theme when I ask people how they heard about Spring. More often than not, they heard about us through social media or received a printed article at an action. And I think this pattern really speaks to what a crucial and successful organizing tool that revolutionary journalism can be. A publication like Spring is by no means a unique or new approach of a revolutionary socialist group. We have consciously chosen to participate in the long-standing tradition of socialist writing. Theorists and revolutionaries from Karl Marx to Vladimir Lenin to Claudia Jones have noted the important role of the publication in building a working-class-led socialist movement. Lenin and other revolutionary socialists living under the Russian Empire argued that a paper was the means through which socialists could build a political party. And since then, left-wing social movements throughout history have consistently produced their own press. In Detroit, during the riots of 1967, Black organizers began producing a community newspaper called the Inner City Voice, which was started in response to the brutal government crackdown on the African American community. The goal of the paper was quoted as being a positive response to the Great Rebellion, elaborating, clarifying, and articulating what was already in the streets, with the goal of trying to build their paper into a vehicle for political organization, education, and change. The activists who launched Inner City Voice used the paper to build what would become the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, which you can learn more about in one of our sessions this afternoon, and I highly recommend it. And today you can still see many left-wing movements and organizations that produce their own publications online via social media and websites or through physical paper, zines, and leaflets. The goal of revolutionary journalism for socialist groups is not only to raise the level of political consciousness within the working class, but to also get workers to act on the basis of these ideas and to build the organizational capacity of socialists. Spring's motto is Socialist Ideas in Action for a reason, and the publication goes hand in hand with the other forms of on-the-ground organizing that Spring undertakes. And one of the key roles of socialist writers or reporters in these situations is to distill and communicate the best lessons from the movements on the ground. This means our members are also on the ground at sites of struggle and engaging directly with the working class, reporting back what we see and hear. Ultimately, it's a combination of listening to movements as well as speaking to them. And to achieve this goal, we aim to raise the voices of all those who are marginalized and oppressed under the capitalist system in various ways. We also seek to develop new socialist writers and to help grow the movement through these new writers, who in the process of writing are able to build their knowledge, capacity, and confidence in organizing for a better future. And to this point, revolutionary journalism is also a form of self-clarification and political growth, which is gained through thoughtful research and the act of applying socialist theory to concrete political questions and situations. And this not only serves the audience, but the journalist. Essentially, our writing is not meant to show off our personal knowledge of socialist theory or history, but it's about trying to take the best ideas from the past and present and make them accessible and relevant to the current working class. During Lenin's day, physical newspapers and pamphlets were the cutting-edge approach to disseminating information. But as we entered the digital age, the ways we share information and our journalism has changed. We rely heavily on the SpringMag website and social media to share our content and get the word out about current events or upcoming actions. And another popular medium is, of course, podcasts. My Spring Radio comrade Sarah recently shared a meme with the team that pretty accurately said that we should start a podcast as this generation's we should totally start a band. And so while there's no shortage of political podcasts, it made sense for Spring Magazine to move into this space. Spring Radio launched just over a year ago, the weekend of our inaugural Red October conference, and acts as an extension of the publication and allows us to broaden Spring's reach in terms of our reporting and analysis. And I think it's important now to note the ways that both the magazine and the podcast incorporate the other pillars of Spring you've heard about already, centering equity and rank and file socialism. These are both elements the podcast team considers when it comes to producing an episode. Like the magazine, anyone is free to pitch ideas for episodes to the podcast team, and we work with our comrades to bring these episodes together. This allows Spring members with certain lived experiences or areas of expertise to bring us important episodes and analysis that we may not have otherwise considered. And being an audio medium, the podcast allows us to platform those directly involved in struggle, not just in their words, but in their voices. This also serves to build our relationship with these movements and the organizers that we support. And there's a few examples of this I would like to briefly touch on. I'd like to first take a look at our ongoing episodes surrounding Palestinian liberation over the last year. As I mentioned, Spring Radio launched the weekend of Red October in 2023, and our second episode ever included audio from a Spring meeting that was hosted specifically around the unfolding genocide in Gaza. And it featured Palestinian activist and lawyer Danya Majid, as well as activist and Holocaust survivor Suzanne Weiss and Spring member James Clark. This was followed up by an episode last June on the student encampments that featured students who had just won divestment at their institution, as well as U of T students at the People's Circle for Palestine who are still at their encampment and in the midst of pressuring their school administration. Throughout this past year, Spring members not only wrote consistently about the genocide in Gaza and Palestinian liberation, but our members showed up together for rallies, supported groups like Labor for Palestine and PYM by postering and handing out flyers for actions, and our members were involved in organizing their neighborhood groups for Palestine to pressure their politicians in their ridings to call for a ceasefire and an arms embargo. All these key tactics work together to help support the building of the strong movement for Palestine. And everything we've witnessed and participated in this past year culminated in our most recent episode with Labor for Palestine organizer and Spring member Mo Al-Qassem, which looks at why Palestinian liberation is a labor issue, as well as lessons we have learned over the last 12 months. And I'll just take a second here to quickly plug that Mo will also be speaking more on Palestine and the fight against settler colonialism in one of our first sessions right after this panel. And throughout this past year, we've been able to produce some wonderful episodes with comrades, including episodes on the York Southwestern Tenant Union, solidarity with the people of Sudan, Bangladesh, and political prisoners in the Philippines, and what conservative messaging gets wrong about inflation and the cost of living crisis. We're also able to use the podcast to build support for imminent actions, such as our episode on the Migrant Spring and the Status for All movement, which was pitched to us by our comrade Samuel. He had the opportunity to interview Migrant Workers Alliance for Change organizer Saromro about the Status for All movement in advance of the large rallies across Canada that took place last spring. Spring members have long supported this movement by attending rallies, putting up posters, writing articles, and leafleting for actions in our communities. This piece was an extension of our solidarity with the movement and helped us to strengthen our commitment to fighting for Status for All, as well as strengthen our relationship with the movement organizers. Spring members joined our local branches at the Migrant Spring rallies and were there with banners and handouts featuring articles on why Status for All matters and QR code to our podcast episode. In my own experience with the podcast team, it's played an extremely important role in growing my confidence as an organizer. My background's in television and film production, specifically in the world of post-production, so I was able to volunteer these existing skills to help with the production and editing of the podcast. And in turn, it has allowed me to become more confident in my understanding of socialism, of the goals of Spring, as well as my own abilities as an organizer. I came to Spring with very little experience in the organizing space, and I'm never quick to volunteer to speak in front of large groups of people or be at the front of the room in any situation. And without the opportunity to engage in these activities of revolutionary journalism, I would never be able to do what I'm doing today in speaking with you. So I know firsthand just how impactful Spring Magazine and Spring Radio can be in developing ourselves as revolutionary socialists. We aren't just a publication, but we are a group of organized socialists with a publication. And through our revolutionary journalism, we are not only able to put socialist and ideas and analysis out in the world, but we are given the opportunity to listen and learn, to distill key lessons from movements, and build on them to organize action on the ground. This provides an opportunity both as an organizing tool and a way to strengthen our capacity individually and collectively. Thank you.
Thank you, Heva, Ayesha, and Carlie for those wonderful speeches. Heva, I love that you mentioned the need for theory to integrate forms of oppression that are interrelated to class. It is important to understand that while dialectical materialism is one of our most important tools, there are times when we have to implement other frameworks into our practice. Without all the jargon, what I mean is that we need to cooperate with and support movements that, at first glance, might not seem to be related to socialism or workers' rights. We must support liberation movements of many forms, from indigenous land back to the decolonization movement in Palestine. As a Peruvian, I feel very proud that the most important contribution from José Carlos Mariátegui, often called the first Latin American Marxist, was about the primacy of the indigenous rights movement in our country's fight for socialism. This is because in our country, he thought that indigenous rights and capitalism were incompatible. Why? Because of the question of the land, which is a viewpoint that might sound familiar to the people of Turtle Island. Many Marxists, including Frantz Fanon and Howard Adams, believed socialism could only be achieved after decolonization. Something that impressed me about Red October last year was that the sale in the back of the room had a lot of text about decolonization, including a book on Mariátegui, an extremely obscure theorist outside of Latin America. This convinced me that Spring takes centering equity really seriously. Ayesha, wonderful story about the education workers, and wonderful point about the way that workers appreciate just showing up to the picket line. I remember showing up to a picket line and the workers being like, "You're not a worker? What are you doing here?" You know, they were really surprised and they really appreciated that somebody had shown up even though it wasn't in their best interest or their particular interest. I want to respond to your speech by reading out a fundamental statement by Marx and Engels. The emancipation of the working classes must be conquered by the working classes themselves. Lenin reproached those who claimed to be the vanguard party without having the proper credentials. What is so refreshing about Spring is their philosophy that leadership emerges in the midst of the class struggle by sharing victories and defeats together. In a recent article on our website, Dave Bush says, "The socialists who launched Spring understood that our power to change the world comes from working with others. Workers and the oppressed have to be at the center of remaking the world." When I first got into politics, I wanted to be Che Guevara, or Lenin, or Salvador Allende. What I realized is that there were 81 other revolutionaries that sailed on that boat to Cuba, that thousands of proletarians stormed the Winter Palace together, and that Allende's government was made possible by worker organizations and mass action. An approach that glorifies leaders while ignoring the masses of workers that prop them up is simply not materialist. This is why the rank-and-file approach is so important. Spring does its best to avoid sidelining workers and marginalized voices. Carlie, I love that you mentioned how Marx, Lenin, and other socialists we look up to thought of the publication as an important tool. There's almost an impulse for me to separate revolutionary journalism from socialist praxis, just because it feels weird to feel like I'm doing something important, sitting in front of my computer, putting words on a screen. However, reminding ourselves that these figures that we looked up to were so deeply invested in journalism and even believed it to be part of the earlier phases of revolutionary organization inspires me to keep going. If it was good enough for Marx and Engels, then it's good enough for me. We can also think of some examples of revolutionaries and important figures that were journalists themselves. Marx, Engels, Lenin, Ernest Mandel, Rosa Luxemburg, Antonio Gramsci, John Reed, C.L.R. James, W.E.B. Du Bois, and José Carlos Mariátegui. I also think that the way that you outlined the history of the podcast was fantastic. The sheer amount of ground that you guys have been able to cover is astounding. And that quote, "We aren't just a publication, but a group of organized socialists with a publication," perfectly describes the ethos for our movement. Lenin said that if we can't exert our influence by means of the printed word, it would be utopian to think of more complex and difficult means for exerting influence. Revolutionary journalism is not just important as a tool to organize for the future, but for providing workers with support in the present. These two things are actually intertwined. While there's a final goal of building socialism someday, the magazine is an arm of the movement that helps us organize right now, in the moment. Who knows where Spring will be in 5 years? But right now, we are focused on using this platform in the best and most useful way possible. My personal experiences with Spring have mainly been as a writer and an editor for the publication. I became aware of Spring Magazine because it organized a group to visit the migrant worker encampment near Pearson International Airport last year. I learned that they were organizing a conference in October, so I decided to check it out. It exceeded my expectations, and the people that I met turned out to be extremely intelligent, passionate, and welcoming. Eventually, I started writing for the magazine, I published a book review, and then I started writing reports about local issues. I wrote an article about the People's Circle for Palestine, then one on the Mississauga library workers, then one on the migrant workers, and most recently about the wildfires that are ravaging South America. At every stop, I have realized just how important it is to have alternative media outlets. The way the Palestine protests have been portrayed in the mainstream media has been horrible. The Mississauga library workers were being ignored by local coverage or blamed for some perceived inefficiency in the system. The migrant workers have been getting scapegoated online and in reactionary newspapers. So ever since I wrote a sympathetic article about them, I have been received with hugs at their rallies like an old friend. As socialist writers, we have to be aware that the ruling ideas are the ideas of the ruling class, which means that most media outlets are going to approach workers and minority groups with either outright hostility or suspicion. Media outlets tend to trust institutions more than they trust individuals, so the burden of proof always lies with those who are marginalized rather than those who have the power. Our aim as journalists is to be a breath of fresh air to the people we report on. I think now would be a good time to summarize what SPRING stands for: centering equity, rank-and-file socialism, and revolutionary journalism. Of course, this means having a multifaceted approach to socialism that considers many forms of marginalization and oppression, maintaining the ability to listen to workers' demands, and using the publication as a tool for organizing. While, as an organization, we are capable of making mistakes and we're not perfect, these are the central principles that guide us and that exemplify our vision: solidarity forever.